The laughter started before she even raised the rifle. 32 elite operators standing on the Black Ridge firing line, watching a woman in a standard-issue uniform uncase the most outdated bolt-action anyone had seen at an advanced sniper course in a decade. Someone in the back made a crack about museum pieces. Someone closer laughed loud enough for her to hear it. Master Sergeant Derek Halston didn't bother keeping his voice down when he leaned toward his spotter and said, "Who let the medic onto the championship line?" Maya Voss set her rifle on the rest, checked her wind flags, and said nothing. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that the woman they were laughing at had already taken shots that changed the outcome of missions they'd never been cleared to hear about. Before you go any further, if this story already has you leaning in, hit subscribe and follow along to the very end. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Black Ridge Military Training Center sat at 6,400 feet in the Caraway Mountains, 2 hours from anything resembling a city, and it smelled like pine resin and gunpowder and the specific kind of institutional coffee that had been burning in a pot since 0430. The facility was one of the few places in the country where special operations shooters from multiple branches trained together on the same ranges, competed for records nobody outside the fence line would ever hear about, and spent their downtime quietly assessing everyone around them. It was not a place that welcomed outsiders gracefully. Maya had arrived the previous afternoon in a government transport van with 2 other personnel, neither of whom were participating in the Iron Serpent evaluation. She'd checked in at the front desk with her orders, been assigned a bunk in the transient barracks, and spent the evening cleaning her rifle while the rest of the advanced course participants gathered in the common room to talk gear and compare unit patches. She hadn't gone in to introduce herself. That wasn't cowardice. She just didn't see the point of walking into a room full of people who had already decided what she was based on the fact that her name wasn't attached to any of the programs listed on the week's roster. Her paperwork listed her as a medical support advisor attached to the training evaluation staff. That was what her orders said. That was what the course coordinators had been told. That was the entire picture any of the 32 operators in this facility had been given, and none of them had thought to look further. Most people didn't. She was 38 years old and she had a face that people consistently underestimated. Not beautiful in the dramatic way that made men nervous, but quiet, watchful, with the kind of stillness that some people read as vacancy and others, the smarter ones, eventually understood as patience. She was 5'4" and lean in the way that came from years of actual field work rather than gym hours. And when she moved through a space, she moved efficiently and without announcement. She had learned early that invisibility was a tool. The Iron Serpent evaluation was the centerpiece of the 3-week advanced sniper course, a multi-stage long-range shooting challenge that culminated in a single shot at a target placed at a distance that most military shooters considered theoretical rather than practical. The range record stood at 2,140 meters, set 11 years ago by a shooter whose name Maya knew personally. The course was designed to push operators past their comfort zones, test their ability to read complex environmental conditions, and separate the technically skilled from the ones who could perform under genuine pressure. It was also, unofficially, a showcase. The top shooters from 4 branches were here, and every one of them knew that performance on this range got noticed. Promotion boards, selection panels, unit assignments. The unofficial currency of military careers moved through moments like this, and everyone on that firing line had thought carefully about what they wanted from the week. Maya hadn't thought about any of that. She had thought about her dope book, her wind readings from the previous morning's weather data, and the specific ballistic characteristics of a rifle that most of these operators would dismiss without running a single round through it. The weapon was an older bolt-action military pattern rifle. Not ancient, not broken, not defective in any meaningful way, but visually unremarkable in a field of precision-built custom systems that cost more than some people's cars. She had been shooting variants of that same platform for nearly 15 years. She knew it in a way that went beyond familiarity into something closer to the way a musician knows an instrument. The pull weight of its trigger, the way it settled differently in cold air versus warm, the specific harmonic timing of its barrel that she'd mapped so completely she could account for it without thinking. Nobody looking at it from the outside would have known any of that. Derek Halston knew nothing of the kind. He was 34, built wide across the shoulders, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had never been publicly wrong about something important. He'd shot in 3 international military competitions and won 2 of them. His rifle was a custom-built precision instrument that had reportedly taken a gunsmith 18 months to complete. He wore his unit patch with the deliberate positioning of someone who understood that it meant something to the people around him. And when he walked onto the range, the space rearranged itself slightly in his direction. He had noticed Maya the moment she arrived at the firing line. "That thing loaded?" he said, nodding toward her rifle. He wasn't asking because he cared about range safety. His tone carried the specific texture of a joke being told to an audience that happened to include its subject. "It'll be loaded when I'm ready to fire," Maya said, not looking up from her equipment check. "Where's your support gear?" He glanced at the minimal kit beside her position: a compact wind meter, a data book, a small ranging device, a single rear bag. "You running this thing with that setup?" "I'm running it with what I have." Someone down the line made a comment she didn't catch the exact words of, but the laughter that followed it was sharp and brief, the kind that required a common reference point. She didn't ask what the joke was. The range safety officer called them to their positions, and the first stage of the evaluation began. The Iron Serpent ran in 3 stages, each one stepping the distance and complexity higher. First stage was a cold bore shot at 800 meters on a precision target, followed by a rapid engagement sequence at 1,000 meters. Stage 2 introduced a moving target element and a transition drill. Stage 3 was the final shot, a single round at 2,000 meters, fired within a 6-minute time window, on a target that was a quarter of the size that most shooters would have preferred. The scoring rubric weighted both accuracy and consistency, and the evaluation staff tracked each shooter's performance across all 3 stages before calculating the composite. Halston went through the first 2 stages with the kind of performance that was genuinely impressive. He was technically precise, composed under the time pressure, and his equipment did exactly what it was designed to do. A few of the other operators matched him on individual strings. None of them put together the same consistency across both stages. Maya shot 5th in the rotation. She shot the cold bore at 800 meters, and the round hit within 3 millimeters of center. Nobody reacted visibly, but she noticed the range officer mark something on his clipboard with a slightly different quality of attention than he'd been giving the previous shooters. She moved through the rapid engagement sequence without rushing, without the kind of performative efficiency that some shooters use to signal confidence, just working through the targets, the same way she'd worked through thousands of them over the course of a career that these people knew nothing about. When her Stage 2 scores were posted, she was sitting 2nd overall, 2 points behind Halston. The reaction on the line was quiet and uncomfortable in the specific way that happens when an assumption collides with evidence. A few operators reassessed her with the slightly unfocused look of people recalculating. Halston glanced at the board, then at her, and his expression did something complex that settled back into dismissal before he turned away. "Stage 2's not the test," he said, to no one in particular. "Anyone can shoot at 1,000 meters." She didn't respond to that either. The gap between Stage 2 and the final stage was a 90-minute break, lunch, equipment prep, a weather briefing from the range meteorologist. The wind at Black Ridge was famously unpredictable. The mountains created crosswind channels that could shift direction and speed within a single shooter's natural firing window, and the 2,000-meter line sat in a valley configuration that funneled those channels in ways that didn't always match what the flags at the line indicated. Maya spent the break reviewing her data and eating half a protein bar that tasted like compressed sawdust, which she finished entirely because she'd learned a long time ago not to let personal preference interfere with function. She was sitting on a bench outside the equipment bay when someone sat down a few feet away from her without preamble. She looked up. He was maybe 31, with the compact, economical build common to naval special warfare, and an expression that was actually looking at her rather than through her. His unit patch indicated a SEAL team. His rifle case, leaning against the bench beside him, was high-end but well-used. "Ethan Cole," he said, not trying to be weird, just wanted to say that was good shooting. "Maya Voss." "I know, I checked the board." He glanced at her rifle, now resting across her knees in a soft case. "What's your dope book say for the final stage? You actually running it with that platform?" "That's what I have." He was quiet for a moment, and she could tell he was working through something. "The valley configuration out there, The wind's going to shift twice during the firing window. I tracked it from this morning's early session. There's about a 40-second sweet spot in the middle where the channel stabilizes. If you don't have a platform that can extract a consistent muzzle velocity at that distance, the shift timing doesn't matter. She looked at him steadily. I know about the shift. I know you know about the shift. He paused. What I'm saying is your rifle is going to be at the edge of its envelope at 2,000. The ballistic coefficient on those standard match rounds won't give you the terminal stability you need if the second shift catches you late. He wasn't showing off. He was just saying the thing plainly. Mine will. She didn't say anything for a moment. I'm not trying to take something from you, he said. Your shooting's better than half the people on this line. I just want to see what happens when someone gives you the right tool. That was a harder thing to respond to than the mockery had been. The final stage drew everyone who wasn't actively shooting to the observation area. The 2,000-meter line was dramatic in its own right. The target was visible only through spotting scopes, a small geometric shape at a distance that made the naked eye supply only a vague impression. The mountain wind made the flags at the firing point snap and flutter in patterns that required continuous interpretation. The sky had gone from clear to partly cloudy since the morning, and the light was changing in ways that added another variable to a problem that was already technically demanding. Halston shot third in the final rotation. He took his time, which was correct procedure. Rushing the final stage was the most common way to throw a good composite score into a bad one. He tracked the wind, built his firing solution, and settled into his natural respiratory pause. The shot broke cleanly. The target indicator at 2,000 meters registered a hit. The line erupted. It wasn't the range record. The bullet had landed 6 inches right of center, which was a very good shot, but not a perfect one. But it was a confirmed hit at a distance that a significant percentage of trained snipers would miss entirely. And Halston received the congratulations with the specific, gracious composure of someone who had expected to succeed. He looked at the board where Maya's position in the rotation placed her 3 slots later, and he said, "Let's see what museum pieces can do at this distance." The laughter was shorter than it had been that morning. Not everyone joined it. Maya shot 7th. She settled behind the rifle and immediately understood what Cole had identified. The platform was familiar to her in the way of a borrowed instrument. She knew the type, had fired variants of it before, but this specific system had its own personality. She was mapping in real time. She didn't have the depth of data on it she had on her own rifle. That was a genuine disadvantage. But she had what she always had, which was the ability to be still in a way that most people spent their entire careers trying to learn. She read the wind through the flags, through the mirage patterns visible through her scope, through the felt texture of the air at the firing point. She tracked the shift pattern that Cole had described, which matched what she was seeing. The sweet spot was real. It would open and close in roughly 40 seconds, and it was approximately 3 minutes into her firing window. She breathed. She waited. The range officer called the 2-minute mark. Halston, in the observation area, said something she couldn't hear. Cole, standing near him, said nothing. The flags changed. The mirage pattern compressed slightly, indicating the stabilization Cole had predicted. The window was open. Maya's finger moved through the trigger's weight the same way it had moved through it 10,000 times before, and the rifle fired. At 2,000 meters, a target indicator the size of a dinner plate swung hard on its hanger. The range fell into the kind of silence that happens when an entire room tries simultaneously to process something that doesn't fit the story it had been telling itself. Then the range officer said, into a stillness that felt almost physical, "Confirmed hit, center mass." He paused, looking at the ranging data on his display, then looked up at the line. "That's 2,000 meters, dead center. Composite score puts Voss at the top of the board." Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Halston's face went through several things in rapid succession before it settled into a particular kind of stillness that was its own kind of revelation. The expression of a man who has just understood that the laughter was the wrong response and is now trying to process what the right one would have been. Maya set Cole's rifle on the rest and sat back. She was aware of the attention on her. The weight of 32 people recalculating their assumptions was something she'd felt before, and she'd learned to let it exist without reacting to it. She unzipped her equipment bag to retrieve her data book and noted the firing solution and outcome in the same small, precise handwriting she'd been using since she was 23 years old. The sound of boots on the hard-packed earth behind the firing line came at a cadence she recognized. Purposeful. Senior. She didn't have to turn around to know what that sound meant. When she did turn around, the man walking toward the line wore 2 stars on his collar and an expression that was unreadable in the way that senior general officers tended to be unreadable. Not cold, but controlled, their faces long since trained to reveal only what they chose to reveal. She had not expected him here. She had not expected this at all. General Adrian Whitmore stopped at the edge of the firing line, surveyed the row of shooters and observers, and then looked directly at Maya Voss in a way that was not the look of a general officer inspecting a subordinate. It was the look of a man who had been waiting for the right moment to say something he had been holding for a long time. "Stand easy," he said to the line, though nobody had called attention. Then, to the evaluation staff. "I'd like the composite scores displayed, please." Someone moved to the scoring board. The numbers went up. Maya's name sat at the top, and the margin over second place was not narrow. Whitmore studied the board for a moment, then turned to face the assembled shooters. "How many of you," he said, in the quiet voice of someone who doesn't need volume to command a room, "asked this officer what her background was before you decided what she was?" The silence was different from the one after the shot. That one had been surprise. This one was something more uncomfortable. "How many of you looked at her weapon and made a decision about her capability before she'd fired a single round?" Halston was very still. "Sergeant Voss," Whitmore said, "will someone hand her a roster? I want to know if she recognizes any names on this course." Maya accepted the roster that a young range officer extended toward her, slightly confused. She scanned down the list, recognized 6 names. She'd worked with 2 of them in contexts that were still classified, and 4 others she recognized from training programs and curriculum materials she had developed at least a decade ago. "3 of you," Whitmore said, "have benefited directly from the advanced field shooting curriculum that Sergeant Voss developed while she was assigned to Special Operations Forces Training Command." He paused, letting that settle. "2 of you have been through a range course where the targeting methodology and the curriculum came from her work." He let the silence do what it needed to do. Then he said, "She's not a medical support advisor. That's her cover assignment for this evaluation. I wanted to see how this course treated her when they didn't know who she was." Someone in the back of the observation area said quietly, "Oh, hell." Halston's jaw moved. He didn't speak. "She's a former Tier 1 combat sniper with confirmed long-range engagements on record that most of you won't have clearance to read for another decade," Whitmore continued. "She retired from operations 4 years ago. The curriculum she developed is currently in use by special operations units across 6 allied militaries. The shot you just watched her make, on unfamiliar equipment, in variable wind, on a target at the edge of what this platform can do, is the kind of shot she built her career on." He looked at Halston directly. "You judged her uniform. You judged her equipment. You didn't ask a single question that might have complicated your assumptions." He wasn't shouting. He didn't have to. "That's not a character failure. That's a professional failure. And in the field, professional failures have consequences." The range was very quiet. "The lesson today isn't about the shot," Whitmore said. "The shot is the punctuation at the end of a sentence that started the moment she arrived here. The lesson is about what you missed and why you missed it, and what that cost you over the course of this week." He turned back to Maya, and something in his face shifted almost imperceptibly. "Sergeant Voss," he said, "I have a conversation I'd like to have with you when this evaluation wraps. There's a program director position at Red Valley Defense Academy that's been open for 4 months. I've already told them why it's been hard to fill." A pause. "I think you already know why I'm telling you this in front of everyone." Maya looked at him for a long moment. "Yes, sir," she said. "I do." Ethan Cole, standing at the edge of the observation area, said nothing. He hadn't said anything since the shot. But he was looking at the scoring board with an expression that wasn't satisfaction exactly, but close to it. The specific feeling of having understood something correctly in advance of other people understanding it, and of having acted on that understanding without needing to explain it first. Halston stood with his hands at his sides and his expensive rifle in its case at his feet, and he looked at the scoring board, and then he looked at Maya Voss, and then he looked at the floor. The expression on his face in that moment was not one he would have predicted for himself at the start of the morning. It was the expression of a man who had spent the entire day being wrong about the most important thing on the firing line, and who was only now, standing in front of 31 other people and a two-star general, beginning to understand the actual dimensions of what he had gotten wrong. Maya zipped her databook back into her kit. She picked up Cole's rifle, walked it over to him, and set it on the bench beside him. "Clean hit," he said. "Clean hit," she agreed. He nodded, and that was the whole of it, and that was enough. The range officer began collecting score sheets. The evaluation staff moved with the particular briskness of people who have witnessed something they will be describing for years. The Caraway Mountains sat in the middle distance, indifferent and enormous, and the wind that had been shifting and unpredictable all afternoon went still for a moment in a way that felt almost deliberate. Maya shouldered her bag. She was crossing the firing line toward the equipment bay when she heard Whitmore speak again, not to the assembled group this time, but quietly, directly at her back, in a voice low enough that only she would catch it. "There are 4 junior shooters on this course," he said, "who I specifically assigned here because I think they have potential that's going unrecognized. I didn't tell anyone that. I wanted to see if anyone noticed." She stopped. "Did anyone notice?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. When she turned back, his expression had shifted again. The controlled face of the general officer had something else in it now, something that looked like the weight of a question he had been carrying longer than this afternoon. "That," he said, "is exactly the conversation we need to have." The conversation we need to have. Maya turned those words over during the 40-minute drive back to the main compound, sitting in the passenger seat of a government vehicle, while the mountains reduced themselves to shapes in the side mirror. Whitmore had not elaborated. He'd given her a time, 0800 the following morning, his temporary office in the command building, and then moved on to the administrative work of closing out the evaluation, which involved forms and signatures and the particular bureaucratic choreography that followed any official military event regardless of what had actually happened on the day. She'd cleaned her rifle, showered in the transient barracks, eaten something forgettable from the dining facility, and lain awake until around 0200 cataloging what she knew and what she didn't. What she knew. Whitmore had not come to Black Ridge by accident. The Iron Serpent evaluation ran every 18 months, and a 2-star general had never attended it before. Someone had arranged his presence here deliberately, which meant either he had arranged it himself or someone above him had, and both of those possibilities opened different sets of questions. What she didn't know. Which of those questions she actually wanted answers to. She'd left active operations 4 years ago with the specific intention of being done with the version of herself that got sent into the kinds of situations that produced the kinds of records that were still classified. She had taken the curriculum development work because it was useful, and because she was good at it, and because it kept her connected to something she understood without requiring her to be the person she'd been when she was doing the work that the curriculum was designed to teach. That arrangement had suited her. It had been quiet and purposeful, and it had let her sleep with reasonable regularity, which was a thing she had not always been able to say. The Red Valley Defense Academy position was something different. She knew Red Valley. It was a serious institution, not a showcase program, not a political appointment, not the kind of posting that generated press releases and photo opportunities. It trained operators across multiple specialties, and it had a reputation for producing the kind of shooter and field medic and tactical thinker that made other units nervous about competing against them. The program director position was the kind of role that required someone who understood both the technical and the human dimensions of the work, and it paid in the currency of genuine influence rather than title. She was thinking about whether she wanted genuine influence at 0137 in the morning when she heard a knock at her barracks room door. It was Halston. He was in civilian clothes, a gray shirt, utility pants, the kind of baseline clothing that made him look like a different person without the uniform, smaller somehow, or maybe just less certain of the space he occupied. He stood in the hallway with his hands at his sides and an expression she recognized from other contexts, the face of someone who had prepared a speech and was now uncertain whether the speech was the right approach. "I'm not going to make this longer than it needs to be," he said. "All right. I was wrong about you. I was wrong from the start, and I kept being wrong louder than I needed to be." He paused. "I'm not good at this kind of thing. I can tell." He looked at her for a moment. "That's fair?" Another pause. I wanted to say it directly instead of avoiding you for the rest of the week. She considered him. He was not, she thought, a bad person in the fundamental sense. He was a person who had gotten very good at one version of himself and had stopped questioning whether that version had limits. That was a common enough story. She'd seen it produce worse outcomes than an embarrassing day on a firing range. You don't need to feel worse than you already do, she said. But I'm also not going to tell you it was fine, because it wasn't. No, he said. It wasn't. Go to bed, Halston. We can talk more if there's something worth talking about. He nodded, once, and left. She lay back down and stared at the ceiling for another 40 minutes before she finally slept. Whitmore's temporary office was a converted briefing room with a folding table, 2 chairs, a coffee maker that someone had thought to plug in, and a window that looked out at the back of a supply building. He was already there when she arrived at 0755, reviewing something on a tablet, and he waved her toward the chair across from him without looking up. She poured herself coffee. It was better than the dining facility coffee, which was setting a low bar, but she appreciated the gesture. Tell me what you know about the 4 junior shooters, he said. She hadn't been sure he'd actually ask. PFC Adaeze Nwosu, the tall one, 3rd position from the left on the final stage lineup. She shot conservatively on stages 1 and 2, underperforming relative to what her mechanics suggested she was capable of. I think she was managing expectations. Go on. Corporal Reyes. He's left-eye dominant shooting right-handed, which someone corrected for with equipment adjustments, but nobody taught him to use it as an asset in certain wind conditions. He's losing consistency he shouldn't be losing. She paused. Private Stellard. She's the youngest one. She has the best natural trigger discipline on the course, and I don't think anyone's told her that, possibly the opposite. Whitmore set the tablet down. And the 4th? Specialist Kaminsky. He's not a natural shooter. His fundamentals are correct, but they're correct in the way that means he learned them very carefully from someone, rather than finding them himself. And when conditions change, he goes back to the checklist rather than the feel. That's fixable, but not the way he's currently being taught. The general was quiet for a moment. You identified all 4 of them within the first 2 days, he said. It wasn't quite a question. They were visible if you were looking. Nobody else on this course's evaluation staff flagged any of them. She drank her coffee. I know. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked in the specific way that cheap folding furniture creaks. Here's what I'm going to tell you, and I need you to understand that what I'm about to say doesn't leave this room until I tell you it can. She waited. Red Valley has a problem, he said. The program director opening is real, and I want you for it, and those things are both true, but they're not the primary reason I'm here. He looked at her steadily. 3 months ago, one of Red Valley's advanced training cohorts had an incident during a live-fire field exercise. A shooter was seriously injured. The official report attributed it to equipment failure and individual error. But, Maya said, but the equipment didn't fail. I've had 2 independent analysts look at the evidence, and neither of them can make the failure narrative work. He paused. What they can make work is a different narrative. One that involves someone on the training staff making a decision during that exercise that they weren't authorized to make, for reasons that aren't clear yet. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the coffee maker finishing its cycle. You think someone got hurt on purpose, she said. I think the official report is wrong, and I think the people responsible for the official report know it's wrong. He picked up the tablet again, turned it to face her. It showed a photograph of a young man, mid-20s, lean, dark-haired, the careful composed expression of a posed official photo. Specialist Marcus Dre, currently recovering at Carver Medical Facility, spinal injury. He'll walk again probably, but his career is over. She looked at the photograph. What was Dre's profile before the incident, she asked. Top of his cohort, exceptional long-range scores. Several people had noted him for potential special operations selection. Whitmore took the tablet back. He had also, in the weeks before the incident, submitted a formal complaint about training practices within his cohort. The complaint was filed with the Red Valley Internal Review Office. And the person he filed the complaint against is currently still on staff and was present during the field exercise. He set the tablet face down on the table. The official report does not mention the complaint. It does not mention that individual's proximity to Dre during the incident. It attributes everything to equipment and individual error, and it closes with a recommendation that training protocols be reviewed. Maya set her coffee cup down. You want me to go to Red Valley as program director, she said slowly, and you want me to find out what actually happened. I want you to go to Red Valley as program director because you are the right person for that job on its own merits. What I'm telling you additionally is that there is something at that installation that needs to be looked at by someone with the background to recognize what they're seeing and the standing to act on it. He paused. If you go and you find nothing, the job is still the job. If you go and you find something, I need to know what it is before anyone else does. She was quiet for a long time. Who knows about this conversation? 2 people above me, nobody at Red Valley. Who's my contact if I find something? Me, directly, nobody in the Red Valley chain. He slid a card across the table, plain, with a number handwritten on it, no other identifying information. Burn that after you memorize it. She picked it up. When do you need an answer? You have 24 hours, but I'd rather have it sooner. He stood, which she took as a signal that the formal part of the conversation was finished. For what it's worth, Sergeant Voss, I've known about your work for longer than yesterday. The evaluation here was partly about seeing how you handle the thing you handled yesterday, being dismissed, being underestimated, having to perform under conditions that weren't designed to give you a fair assessment. And you handled it exactly the way I hoped you would. He moved toward the door, then stopped. The 4 junior shooters. Before you leave Black Ridge, would you be willing to spend an hour with each of them? Nothing formal, just what you noticed, what you tell them. Yes, she said, without having to think about it. He nodded and left. She sat with her coffee and the blank ceiling and the weight of a decision she had already mostly made before he'd finished explaining it. She found a Desnosu at the range equipment bay, running a cleaning rod through her rifle with the focused concentration of someone using a task to manage her thoughts. The young soldier was 22, originally from somewhere in the Pacific Northwest based on her accent, and she had the specific quality of stillness that Maya recognized as potential being deliberately contained. You were shooting under your actual capability yesterday, Maya said without preamble. Nwosu looked up. She recognized Maya. The composite scores had made Maya's name visible to everyone on the course within about 45 minutes of their posting. I was shooting within my confidence window, she said carefully. Your confidence window is set about 200 meters short of where your mechanics say it should be. Who told you to keep it there? A pause. Nobody told me directly, but somebody communicated it. Nwosu set the cleaning rod down. There was a senior NCO at my last unit who said my fundamentals were good, but my consistency under pressure was a risk, that I should prove myself in the closer ranges before I pushed out further. When did he say that? About 8 months ago. Have you shot further out since then? At practice, not in evaluation. Maya pulled a chair from against the wall and sat down, which changed the geometry of the conversation from something incidental to something deliberate. The NCO was giving you advice about managing external perception of your performance. That's a real thing. But he was giving you tactical career advice, and you turned it into a technical limitation. Those are different. She looked at her directly. You have the trigger discipline and the wind-reading instinct to push further. What you don't have is permission from yourself to do it in front of people who matter. Enus was quiet for a moment. How do you fix that? You probably already know how. You just want confirmation. Something shifted in the young soldier's expression. Not quite a smile, but the thing that precedes a smile when someone isn't sure yet if the moment calls for one. You shoot in front of the people who matter, she said, until it's the same as shooting alone. That's about 80% of it, Maya said. The other 20% is that you have to stop assuming that failing in front of someone who matters is worse than succeeding smaller than you're capable of. One of those is a temporary setback. The other one follows you. She spent just under an hour at the equipment bay, and when she left, Nwosu was reassembling her rifle with a slightly different quality of intention in the way her hands moved. The other 3 conversations were shorter and less dramatic. Reyes needed a specific technical adjustment explained, and the permission to experiment with it, which took 20 minutes. Stellard needed to be told plainly that her trigger discipline was exceptional, and that the instructor who had told her she was inconsistent was measuring the wrong thing, which took 10 minutes and produced the most visible reaction of the 4 conversations. a controlled but unmistakable shift in the set of her shoulders, the physical effect of a long-held tension releasing. Kaminsky needed something she couldn't fully give him in an hour. He needed to rebuild his relationship with instinct rather than procedure. But she gave him an exercise, something concrete he could practice, and a way of thinking about the difference between following a checklist and internalizing what the checklist was pointing toward. She was finishing with Kaminsky near the back fence of the training area when she heard someone approach from her left. She knew the footfall before she turned. Cole. He fell into step beside her without asking permission, which she didn't mind. "How are they?" he asked. "Better than they were yesterday." "That's not nothing." "No," she agreed. "It's not." They walked in the direction of the main compound in the specific, comfortable silence of two people who communicate economically and have recognized that quality in each other. The afternoon light had gone flat and gray, the kind of light that made distances hard to judge and gave everything an indeterminate quality. "Whitmore asked you something this morning," Cole said. It wasn't a question. "He did." "You don't have to tell me what." "I know." Another few steps of silence. "Are you going to take it?" She glanced at him. "You have good pattern recognition." "It's part of the job." He paused. "If it's Red Valley, be careful. There are people there who are not what they present as." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. His expression was even and careful, the expression of someone who has measured what they're about to say and is committed to saying exactly that and not more. "I'm not in a position to elaborate, but I've had two friends go through training there in the last year, and both of them came back with the same specific discomfort about one particular program supervisor. Different words, same feeling." "What's the feeling?" "That something was being covered up and they'd been positioned to not see it." The flat gray light sat on the mountains in the middle distance. Somewhere on the far range, someone was running a bolt action through a dry fire sequence, the mechanical sound carrying cleanly through the cold air. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't say anything specific." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." She took the job that evening in a 3-minute phone call with Whitmore's aide that covered the administrative basics and an expected report date of 10 days out. She sent her acceptance in writing as a follow-up, precise and formal. And then she sat in her barracks room and looked at the handwritten number on the plain card for 3 minutes before she committed it to memory. Then she burned the card in the small metal wastebasket near the door, using a match from the range safety kit in her bag. Red Valley Defense Academy sat in the flat high desert of eastern Caraway State, about 90 miles from the nearest city of any size, accessed by a 2-lane highway that ran through scrubland and low rock formations and the occasional wind farm. Maya arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after Black Ridge, in a rental truck carrying everything she owned that was worth transporting, which was not very much. The facility was larger than she'd expected from the photographs. Several hundred acres of training terrain, multiple range complexes, classroom buildings, barracks, and an administrative cluster near the main gate that housed the program offices and the command staff. The design was functional rather than impressive, the architecture of an institution that measured itself by outcomes rather than appearances. She checked in with the front gate, was issued her access credentials, and was escorted to the program director's suite in the administrative building by a young staff sergeant named Okafor, who had the efficient, slightly over-prepared manner of someone who had been briefed extensively on her arrival and was working through a mental checklist. The office was adequate. A desk, a window, a bookshelf that the previous occupant had left partially stocked with training manuals and 2 volumes on ballistic theory that she recognized and approved of. A dry erase board on one wall. The window looked out at the main parady ground, which in the early afternoon was empty of personnel and was being crossed by a single stray field cap tumbling in the wind. "Your orientation meeting with the program staff is scheduled for 1400, Okafor said. "Commander Breck asked me to let you know he'll stop by personally to welcome you at 1600. "Who's Commander Breck?" "Deputy Commandant of Instruction. He oversees all active training programs. You'd report to him on curricular matters and to Commandant General Ives on administrative matters." He paused. "Unofficially, sir, Commander Breck runs most of the day-to-day training operation. General Ives delegates most program authority to him." She made a note of that. "Thank you, Sergeant." He left. She sat at the and looked at the dry erase board for a while, then went to the window and looked at the parade ground. The field cap had lodged itself against the base of a flagpole and was vibrating there in the wind. The 1400 orientation meeting involved 6 program staff members, including 2 whose names she recognized from curriculum documents she'd reviewed during her years in training command, and one she recognized for a different reason, a staff sergeant named Vance Pruitt, who appeared on the internal Red Valley roster as a senior training NCO and who had been present during the field exercise in which Marcus Dre had been injured. The official report had listed Pruitt in a peripheral capacity, range safety support. He had not been named as having direct involvement with Dre's position or equipment on the day of the incident. He appeared in the report 4 times, all in minor administrative capacities. He was also, in the meeting, the first person to speak after her introduction, which struck her as deliberate. "We've heard a lot about Black Ridge," Pruitt said, in a tone calibrated to land somewhere between collegial and testing. "Sounds like a memorable evaluation." "Evaluations usually are," she said. "The composite score data came through the training network. People are talking about the long-range final stage." He smiled, and it was a technically adequate smile. The right muscles in the right positions. Welcome to a place where that kind of performance is expected every week. She looked at him with an expression that gave him nothing. "Good," she said. "Then I'll fit right in." The meeting ran for an hour. She asked questions that were appropriate to her role: curriculum structure, evaluation cycles, cohort composition, logistical support. She did not ask about the incident. She did not indicate in any way that she knew Pruitt's name from any context other than the staff roster. She listened more than she spoke, which was something she was good at, and she watched how the room oriented itself. Who deferred to whom, who glanced at whom before speaking, what the hierarchy beneath the hierarchy looked like, and the small, visible evidence of a group of people who worked together and had established their patterns over time. By the end of the hour, she had a reasonable map of the interpersonal geography of her program staff and a clearer picture of which of the questions she'd brought with her were going to be easy to answer and which were going to require patience. Pruitt left the meeting without making further direct conversation, which told her something about his calculation of how to play the initial interaction. He was not a person who overextended. He was a person who measured and waited and let the situation develop. She filed that away. Commander Breck arrived at 6:02, 2 minutes late, which she noted without attaching significance to. I was 51, thick through the neck and shoulders, in the way that comes from a genuine physical history, rather than gym work, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into authority. He shook her hand with the specific practiced warmth of a man who was good at meeting people and knew it. "Sergeant Voss," he said, "you're exactly what we need here. The program has been running on momentum since the director position opened up, and momentum without direction is just drift." "I appreciate the candor," she said. "I believe in it." He sat down across from her without being invited, which was a dominance gesture so practiced she doubted he was aware of making it. "I want us to work well together. I also want to be straight with you about how things operate here, because some people come in expecting the org chart to tell the whole story and find out too late that it doesn't." "Tell me how things operate," she said. "Training programs live and die on consistency. My job is to protect the training environment from things that disrupt the consistency. Administrative interference, political pressure, evaluation criteria that shift based on who's watching that week." He leaned back. "I've built a program here that gets results because the people in it know what's expected and know that the expectations don't change based on outside attention. What I need from a program director is someone who understands that and operates within it." She nodded slowly. "I've reviewed the 4-year performance record," she said. "The results are strong across most metrics. There are some areas where I have questions." "Of course. That's what the review process is for." "Including the Dre incident." A pause so brief that someone who wasn't watching carefully would have missed it. Breck's expression didn't change in any significant way. "That case is closed. The review board completed its work." "I understand. I'd still like to review the file. It's relevant to understanding the training environment and the safety protocols." "Those protocols have already been updated based on the board's recommendations." "Then reviewing the file will confirm that," she said pleasantly. "I'll submit the formal request through Sergeant Okafor." Breck looked at her for a moment with the assessing expression of a man recalibrating. "Of course," he said after a beat. "We run a transparent program here." He stayed another 12 minutes, covering logistics and scheduling and the upcoming cohort evaluation cycle, and when he left, the office felt slightly different, the way a room sometimes feels after someone has spent time in it measuring it for something other than what they said. Maya sat at the desk and looked at the dry erase board for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and wrote 3 words on it, low in the corner where they'd be visible to her and no one else from the doorway: timeline, equipment, access. Those were the 3 things the official report had gotten wrong, according to Whitmore's analysts. Those were the 3 things she needed to reconstruct. She had been at Red Valley Defense Academy for 6 hours, and she had already confirmed 2 things. Vance Pruitt was managing his proximity to her with calculated care, and Commander Breck had someone tell him before the meeting that she was going to ask about the Dre file. The question was who had told him. She hadn't mentioned the file to anyone at Red Valley before that meeting. The only people who knew she was coming, what she was investigating, and what she'd been told to look for were 2 people above Whitmore, names she didn't have, and Whitmore himself. She stared at the dry erase board, and then the implications of that landed in a way that made the whole room go quiet and still around her, because if the information had come from inside the chain of command that was supposed to be protecting this investigation, then the thing she had walked into was considerably larger and considerably more dangerous than a single training incident at a remote military academy. Her phone sat on the corner of the desk. She did not pick it up. Not picking up the phone was the right call, and she knew it within about 30 seconds of making it. If the information about her investigation had leaked from inside Whitmore's chain, then the phone was a liability. Not because it was compromised necessarily, but because using it to contact Whitmore directly would tell whoever was watching that she'd figured out there was a leak, and that was information she needed to hold for as long as she could. The moment they knew she knew, the window she was working in would close. Evidence would move, people would get their stories straight. The kind of institutional closing of ranks that had already produced 1 falsified accident report would produce more, faster, and with the specific efficiency of people who had already practiced it once. She left the phone on the desk and went to find Sergeant Okafor. He was in the small administrative office 2 doors down from hers, working through a stack of intake paperwork for the incoming cohort. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, immediately arranged his expression into professional attention. "Sergeant, I'd like a walking orientation of the training ranges before the light goes. Just me and you. I want to get the physical layout in my head before I start reviewing the program files." "Of course, ma'am. I can have a vehicle. I'd rather walk it." A slight pause. He recalibrated. "Yes, ma'am." They went out through the back of the administrative building and onto the main access road that connected the compound to the range complexes. Okafor was 24 and competent, and he had the specific quality of someone who paid attention to things without necessarily knowing what they meant. She had identified that quality in the orientation meeting when he'd been the only staff member who tracked the room's reaction to her question about Breck rather than tracking her. She let him lead the orientation for the first 10 minutes. Range Complex A, B, and C, the distances, the operational configurations, the maintenance schedule. She asked appropriate questions about sight lines and wind patterns. She was mapping something else entirely. "The field exercise range," she said, when they reached the junction where the main access road branched east toward a longer terrain course. "That's the one further out?" "Yes, ma'am. Roughly 2 kilometers east. It's not on the standard orientation route." "Let's go anyway." The terrain shifted as they walked, the flat scrubland giving way to low rises and shallow draws, the kind of ground that required more deliberate foot placement. The late afternoon light was going orange at the edges, long shadows cutting across the rock. It was the kind of landscape that looked empty but wasn't. She could see the evidence of regular human activity in the worn paths between fixed positions, the hardware anchored into the rock at the observing points, the cabling that ran at ground level toward a central monitoring station. "The Dre incident happened here," she said. It wasn't a question. Okafor's pace slowed by perhaps half a step. "Yes, ma'am." "Walk me through the range configuration as it was during that exercise." A careful pause. "I wasn't part of the exercise staff that day. But you know the setup." The after-action documentation described it. The positions were... He stopped, looked at her sidelong. "Ma'am, that incident is formally closed. Commander Breck asked that staff avoid relitigating it with incoming leadership until the updated protocols have been reviewed." "Commander Breck asked the staff not to discuss it with me?" He looked uncomfortable in the specific way of a person caught between two authorities and uncertain which one represented the greater consequence. He asked that it be handled through the formal file review process. So he did tell you I'd be asking about it. The discomfort deepened. He looked at the terrain ahead of them, rather than at her. Sergeant Okafor, she said quietly, I want you to understand that I'm not asking you to put yourself at risk. I'm asking you to tell me what you know. Those are different requests. He was quiet for about 15 seconds, and she let the silence do its work. The range layout that day wasn't standard for the exercise type, he finally said. The positions were closer to the impact zone than the protocol specifies for that live fire configuration. I helped set up the day prior, and I flagged it to the range NCO. Who was the range NCO? Pruitt. She kept her face neutral. What did Pruitt say when you flagged it? He said the distances had been cleared by the program director's office. A pause. That position was vacant. There was no program director at the time. She walked in silence for a moment. Who told Pruitt the distances had been cleared? He didn't say. I assumed it was Commander Breck, but I don't know that for certain. The field exercise range opened up in front of them as they crested a low rise, a broad flat area bounded by rock outcroppings on three sides, with marked positions and target frames and the kind of established infrastructure that comes from years of repeated use. She studied it, mapped the geometry of it, noted where the impact zone sat relative to the shooter positions. She could see it immediately. The positions were set up at distances that put a shooter in an envelope where a certain category of equipment malfunctioned, specifically the kind that would be attributed to individual error, injury that looked like accident but wasn't. The margin was narrow enough to require foreknowledge of the malfunction. It was not, could not be, the result of a simple miscalculation. Someone had designed this. Thank you, Sergeant, she said. I've seen what I needed to see. Let's head back before we lose the light. The Dre file arrived in her inbox at 0730 the following morning in the form of a scanned document set that had the specific quality of materials that have been reviewed before transmission, not obviously redacted, but incomplete in ways that required knowing what should be there to notice what wasn't. The equipment inspection records from the day of the incident were present, but covered only post-incident assessment. The pre-exercise equipment certification forms, which should have been part of any live fire field exercise documentation package, were absent. She sent a follow-up request to the administrative office for the pre-exercise certification forms. The response came back 40 minutes later. Those records were part of a separate equipment management file and would require a request through the Logistics Command Office. She submitted that request. At 10:30, she held her first formal meeting with the incoming cohort, 23 operators, mixed specialties, the kind of group that had been selected carefully and knew it. She ran a standard first-day introduction, expectations, evaluation structure, her background presented in the spare factual terms appropriate to the setting. She watched the room the same way she always watched rooms. 3 of the 23 were tracking her with the attentiveness of people who had done their research. 2 were performing attentiveness without actually providing it. 1, a young staff sergeant named Dariella Obi, sitting in the second row left, was watching her with an expression that Maya recognized because she'd seen it in 3 of the 4 junior shooters at Black Ridge. The careful containment of someone who knows more than they're showing. After the session, as the cohort filed out, she said, "Sergeant Obi, hold on a moment." Obi stopped. "Let the others clear." When they were alone, she turned to face Maya with a composure that was a fraction too controlled to be casual. "You were in the cohort 6 months ago," Maya said. "The one that overlapped with Dre." "Yes, ma'am." "You knew him." A pause. "We were in the same rotation for the first 3 weeks. I want you to tell me something. Not on the record, not formal, not going anywhere unless you decide it does." She looked at her steadily. "What did Marcus Dre tell you about the complaint he filed?" Obi was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Maya thought she was going to decline. "He said Pruitt was running the live fire exercises in a way that punished certain shooters," Obi said finally. "Not overtly. Nothing you could point to cleanly. But there was a pattern where operators who performed above a certain level would get assigned to positions or configurations that were harder in ways that weren't documented as harder. So when their scores came back lower, it looked like performance regression, not manipulation. Why would Pruitt want top performers to score lower?" Marcus thought it was about selection, which operators got flagged for advancement referrals. Pruitt controls the practical evaluation component, which weights heavily in the referral recommendations. She paused. If you can make certain operators look inconsistent, they don't get referred upward. Someone else does, someone you're positioned to recommend. Maya filed that. Who was Dre going to name besides Pruitt? Obi's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He wouldn't tell me. He said the more people who knew, the more risk there was before he could get the complaint formally processed. Did he seem scared? The question landed with its full weight. Obi looked at the middle distance for a moment. He seemed like someone who thought he had a process to use and believed the process would protect him. He wasn't scared. A pause. He should have been. After Obi left, Maya sat at the front of the empty classroom for a few minutes, with the specific quality of stillness that meant she was thinking hard and had stopped performing composure because there was no audience for it. The picture was assembling. It was ugly, and it had more architecture than a single bad actor could have built. It required institutional cover, which meant Pruitt was a component, not the origin, which brought her back to Breck. The Logistics Command Office returned her request for the pre-exercise certification forms at 14:15 with a response that said the records were being retrieved from archival storage and would be available within 5 to 7 business days. She stared at that response for a moment and then picked up her desk phone, the internal line, the base landline, and called the Logistics Command Office directly. This is Program Director Voss. I submitted a records request this morning. I'd like to understand the retrieval timeline. The clerk on the other end had the specific vocal texture of someone who had been told something about this call before it happened. Yes, ma'am. Those records are in off-site archive storage. The process takes... Those records should be in the active administrative files for this fiscal year. Live fire exercise certification documentation has a mandatory 18-month active retention requirement under Safety Protocol 14C. A pause. I'll need to check with my supervisor. I'll hold. She held for 4 minutes before the supervisor came on, a warrant officer named Tarbell, who had a careful, neutral voice and the specific cadence of someone delivering a prepared statement. Director Voss, the records you're requesting were transferred to archive storage as part of a routine file management process. The transfer was authorized by the Deputy Commandant's office. By Commander Breck's office. By that office, yes, ma'am. When was the transfer authorized? Another pause. I'd have to check the exact date. Can you check right now? The pause that followed was longer. 11 days ago. 11 days ago was 2 days after Whitmore had offered her the position, which meant someone had known she was coming before the formal acceptance and had used that 11-day window to move the documentation. She thanked Tarbell, set the receiver down carefully, and looked at the dry erase board. Timeline. Equipment. Access. She had timeline. The certification records had been moved preemptively, which confirmed that whoever ordered the move had advanced knowledge of her appointment and understood what she would look for. That was not Pruitt acting alone. Pruitt did not have the standing to authorize a records transfer through the Deputy Commandant's office. That was Breck. What she didn't have yet was the equipment chain, the physical evidence of what had been done to the position configuration or Dre's gear before the exercise. The post-incident inspection had found no defect, which was exactly what she'd expect if the pre-exercise setup had been the issue rather than the equipment itself. You didn't need to damage the gear. You needed to put the person in the wrong position, at the wrong distance, in the wrong configuration, and then let physics do what physics does. She needed the original range layout diagrams, not the post-incident reconstruction, the actual pre-exercise setup schematics. Those would be in the field exercise planning files, which were separate from the administrative training files and fell under a different records management system, one that Breck's authorization might not extend to. She needed to find that system's access point before someone realized she knew to look. She pulled up the base organizational chart on her computer and started tracing the records management structure. The field exercise planning files fell under the operations training branch, which was managed independently of the main administrative office. The operations training branch NCO was a master sergeant named Felicity Rourke, whose office was in a separate building on the south side of the compound. Maya shut down her computer, picked up her notebook, and walked there. Rourke was 50, compact, and had the expression of someone who had spent a career navigating institutional politics by mastering the art of being technically indispensable. Her office was orderly in the specific way that indicated she knew where every piece of paper was and why, which Maya found immediately reassuring. "I'm reviewing the field exercise program structure," Maya said, after the brief pleasantries. "I need to look at the planning files for the exercises run in the last 12 months. Is that request handled through your office?" "It is," Rourke said. "That's our system, different from the main admin files." "Good. I'd like to submit a formal request." Rourke pulled up a form on her computer. "This will take a standard 3-day processing window for the routine review pathway." "I understand. If I needed to expedite for program continuity purposes, is there a mechanism for that?" Rourke gave her a slightly longer look than the question required. "Program Director designation carries priority access status. I can process same day if you're submitting under that designation." "I am." "Then I'll have something for you by end of day." She typed for a moment, then stopped. "Ma'am, you specifically want the planning files, not the after-action files." "Correct. Pre-exercise planning documentation." Rourke's typing slowed. She looked at her screen with an expression that was doing something careful and quiet. "The planning files for the period you're describing include some records that weren't flagged in the main administrative system. I want to make sure you understand what you're asking for." Maya looked at her. "I understand what I'm asking for." Rourke held her gaze for a moment. Then she typed something, hit submit, and said, "I'll have the package on your secure terminal by 1700. "Thank you, Sergeant." Maya was almost at the door when Rourke said quietly, "Sergeant Dre did good work here. He deserved better." Maya turned. Rourke was looking at her screen again, her expression professionally neutral. "Yes," Maya said. "He did." The package was on her secure terminal at 1648. She locked her office door and went through it methodically, starting with the most recent exercises and working backward. The planning documentation for the exercise in which Dre had been injured was filed under a cover date that was 3 days after the actual exercise date, which was irregular but not unprecedented, the kind of administrative slip that happened in high-tempo training environments and was usually meaningless. Except that the cover date meant the document would sort incorrectly in a date-filtered search, pushing it toward the edge of a review window rather than the center. She went through the position configuration schematics on page 11 and found exactly what she expected. The positions as planned were standard protocol distances. No deviation. Everything within safety margins. Then she found page 17. Page 17 was a range modification addendum, a document type used to record authorized changes to exercise configurations that occurred between the planning phase and execution. Modification addenda were supposed to be signed by both the range NCO and the program director's office before implementation. The addendum for this exercise had one signature, Pruitt's. The program director line was blank. But there was a date stamp in the upper corner of the form, and that date stamp indicated the document had been accessed in the record system 9 days ago, 2 days after her appointment and 9 days before her arrival. The access log showed a user credential code, which she wrote down in her notebook exactly as it appeared. She kept reading. The modification addendum moved 3 shooter positions closer to the impact zone by distances ranging from 40 to 80 meters. The justification line read, "Wind assessment adjustment per field conditions." There was no wind assessment attached. There was no field conditions notation in any of the supplementary documentation. The position Dre had been assigned was the one moved 80 meters closer. She closed the file, sat back, and looked at the ceiling. The credential code that had accessed the addendum 9 days ago was not Breck's. She didn't know whose it was yet, but the format indicated a user outside the Red Valley administrative hierarchy. The prefix code was different from the standard base identifier. Someone outside Red Valley had accessed this file 9 days ago. She picked up her note and looked at the code again, and the weight of what she was holding settled in the room around her like weather changing. The specific quality of a situation that has just expanded past the boundaries you'd set for it. Her office door handle moved. She looked up. The handle moved again, someone trying it, finding it locked, holding the pressure for a half-second longer than a casual test. Then footsteps moving away down the corridor. She sat very still for a moment, listening to the building settle and the distant sound of the last range session closing down for the evening. And she thought about Ethan Cole saying, "Be careful," in the flat gray light at Black Ridge. And she thought about Whitmore's analysts who couldn't make the failure narrative work, And she thought about Marcus Dre's photograph on a tablet in a folding chair office, and the specific stillness of a career ended before it was supposed to end. Then she thought about the access credential code, and whose it might be, and what it meant that someone from outside Red Valley had been in this file system 9 days ago. She opened a clean page in her notebook and wrote the code at the top. Beneath it, after a long moment, she wrote a name, not because she was certain, but because the pattern was coherent enough to point in a direction that made her hands go steady in the way they went steady on a firing line. The name she wrote was not Breck's. It was not Pruitt's. It was a name she recognized from a document she had read 11 years ago in a classified briefing that she was not supposed to still remember, and the fact that it was here, connected to this file, in this system, meant that what had happened to Marcus Dre was not a cover-up inside a training academy. It was a thread attached to something considerably older and considerably larger, and she had just pulled it. The name was Harlan Steck. She sat with it for a long time, the notebook open in front of her, the credential code in her handwriting at the top of the page, and the name beneath it in the same small, precise script. And she thought about what she knew and in what order she'd learned it, and how much of what she thought she knew was actually confirmed versus inferred. Harlan Steck had been a senior acquisitions officer attached to a joint procurement oversight committee 11 years ago when Maya had been in the later phase of her operational career. She'd seen his name on a briefing document, a document that outlined an internal review of training program contracts across several military installations, a review that had been initiated and then quietly closed before producing any formal findings. She hadn't thought about that document in years. She hadn't needed to. It was the kind of institutional paper trail that accumulated in classified archives and was mostly significant for what it failed to produce rather than what it contained. But she remembered the name because the review had been closed on the specific recommendation of an officer whose signature appeared on the closing memo. And that officer's name had also appeared in a different context in the incident report from a training fatality 3 years prior to the review. The fatality had also been attributed to equipment failure and individual error. She remembered reading that and thinking it was either coincidence or a pattern, and then being deployed and not having time to think about which. Now she was thinking about it. Steck would be in his late 50s now. If he'd stayed in procurement oversight, he'd have the institutional positioning to influence contract structures across multiple training facilities. If Red Valley's training program had contract dependencies, equipment suppliers, evaluation software, referral pipelines into specialty units, then someone with Steck's reach could benefit substantially from controlling which operators got advanced to which programs and which didn't. Dre had been on track for special operations selection. If the referral pipeline from Red Valley to selection programs was being managed corruptly, operators advanced not on merit, but on the recommendation of someone like Pruitt, who was being directed by someone like Breck, who was being directed by someone with the institutional reach of Steck, then the injury hadn't been about silencing a complaint. It had been about eliminating a candidate who would have exposed the selection manipulation by being too good to credibly exclude through normal means. You can adjust scores. You can restructure evaluations. You can shift a position 80 meters closer to an impact zone and call it a wind assessment adjustment. But you can't make someone like Dre look mediocre when he's genuinely exceptional, not if he makes it to selection and performs there the way he performed here. So you make sure he doesn't make it. She closed the notebook. The credential code was there in her memory now, solid and specific, and the name beneath it. She didn't need the paper. She had a problem, though, and it was not a small one. She couldn't contact Whitmore through any channel she currently trusted. The leak that had warned Breck of her investigation had come from somewhere in the two-person layer above Whitmore, which meant either Whitmore's chain of trust was compromised or Whitmore himself was a more complex figure than he'd presented. She didn't want to believe the latter. His behavior at Black Ridge had been consistent with genuine integrity. His reading of the situation had been accurate, and his purpose in sending her here had seemed real. But she had operated long enough to know that genuine integrity and genuine compromise could occupy the same person at different points in time or in different domains, and she was not in a position to assume. What she needed was a channel that bypassed both Red Valley's hierarchy and Whitmore's immediate chain. She needed Cole. Not because he was the right resource institutionally. He wasn't, his involvement had no formal standing, but because he'd warned her, which meant he had existing knowledge. And existing knowledge meant existing contacts. and his branch operated its own investigative infrastructure that did not run through the same procurement oversight channels that Steck would have access to. The problem was reaching him without using a traceable channel. She looked at her desk phone for a long moment and then did something she hadn't done in 4 years. She reconstructed, from memory, the communications protocol she'd used during the latter phase of her operational career for contact in environments where standard channels were compromised. It was an analog protocol, specific, indirect, requiring someone on the other end to be looking for the signal. And it required Cole to have the training to recognize it, which she wasn't certain he did. She was fairly certain he did. She composed a brief message in the framework of an administrative equipment inquiry, routed it through the base's inter-installation training network to a SEAL team training liaison address that she accessed through the Red Valley Training Partnership Directory, and flagged it with a specific reference number that meant nothing in its administrative context and everything in the operational context she was borrowing. Then she left the office, locked it, and went to the dining facility for dinner because she needed to eat and because staying in the office after hours with the lights on would be visible from the corridor. She slept 4 hours and woke at 02:30 with the specific quality of alertness that meant her subconscious had been working the problem while her body rested. She lay in the dark and let the architecture of it complete itself. The access credential code that had accessed the range modification addendum 9 days ago, she needed to confirm whose code it was. The format had indicated external access, outside the Red Valley hierarchy. If she could confirm the credential was registered to Steck or anyone in his immediate network, she had the connective tissue linking the document manipulation directly to someone above Breck. The way to confirm that was through the base IT security system, which logged external access events and maintained credential registries for inter-installation network users. That system was administered by a tech sergeant in the communications building whose name she'd noted in the staff directory. She needed that access log, and she needed it before someone in Breck's office noticed she'd pulled the planning files and figured out what she'd found in them. The timeline was compressing. At 0600 she was dressed, and at the communications building before the main compound was fully staffed. The tech sergeant, a young man named Corporal Westing, who was running a morning system check with the focused, slightly glazed attention of someone who'd been at his desk since 0500, looked up when she arrived and straightened instinctively. "I need an external access audit for the operations training records system," she said. "Specifically user credential logs for access events in the last 30 days. I'm requesting this under Program Director Priority Access Status." Westing blinked. "Ma'am, that request would normally go through. I know what it normally goes through. I'm making it directly because I need it before the morning administrative cycle runs, which will overwrite the temporary access buffer for the log period I need." This was technically accurate. It was also information most people in the building wouldn't know to verify in the next 15 minutes. "Can you pull it?" He pulled it. She stood beside him while the log populated on his screen, watching the credential entries tick past. Base users, routine access events, the normal daily volume of an active record system. And there, on the date 9 days ago, one access event from a credential prefix she didn't recognize as Red Valley Standard. "That entry," she said, pointing. "Can you tell me the registered user for that credential?" Westing typed. The system returned a name and an organizational affiliation. The name was not Harlan Steck. It was a colonel named Pilar Vasquez, registered as a liaison officer for the Defense Training Oversight Division. She processed that for about 3 seconds, then, "Print that page, please," and the 2 pages preceding it. He printed it. She folded the pages into her notebook, thanked him, and walked back to her office at the same pace she'd been walking all morning. Vasquez. She didn't know that name. But the Defense Training Oversight Division was the current iteration of the same procurement review body that had launched and quietly closed the review 11 years ago. The one whose closing memo had borne the signature she'd connected to the prior training fatality. The division had been reorganized twice since then, renamed once, but its core function hadn't changed. It held audit and oversight authority over training contracts and selection, pipeline integrity across all major military training installations. If Vasquez was accessing Red Valley's planning files 9 days before Maya's arrival, Vasquez was not doing routine oversight. Oversight would have gone through formal channels. This was something else, a specific targeted pull of a specific document, timed to coincide with the period after Maya's appointment became known. Either Vasquez was working with whoever was covering this up, or Vasquez was running a parallel investigation. She sat at her desk and considered both possibilities with equal weight, because assuming the more comfortable answer had gotten people hurt before, and she was not going to make that error. The morning staff meeting ran from 0800 to 0900 and was unremarkable except for Pruitt's absence, which he attributed via message to a range safety inspection that had been moved to the morning slot. The absence was plausible. She noted it anyway. At 0930, Commander Breck came to her office unannounced. He sat down in the chair across from her desk with the ease of a man who is accustomed to having offices arrange themselves around him and said, "I understand you've been pulling records through several different channels." "That's correct," she said. "I'm reviewing the full program documentation as part of my onboarding assessment. The planning files aren't typically part of onboarding assessment. They're for me." She held his gaze evenly. "I like to understand the full operational picture before I start making curricular recommendations. It saves revision time later." He studied her for a moment. He was good at this. The contained, assessing attention of a man who was deciding whether what he was seeing was a problem or a manageable situation. "I want to make sure you're getting accurate context," he said. "Some of those files contain documentation that looks irregular in isolation, but makes complete sense when you understand the operational circumstances around it. That's why I'm pulling everything rather than a selection," she said. "So I have the full context." A beat. "The Dre incident," he said. "I want you to hear it from me directly. It was a tragedy. The board found no institutional negligence. We've updated the protocols. That case is a scar on this program's record, and the last thing I want is for an incoming director to form her assessment of this institution based on a worse moment that's already been addressed." He sounded almost reasonable. She recognized the technique, the managed concession, the emotional framing around a protected core, the invitation to accept the context he was offering and set aside the questions he didn't want her to pursue. "I appreciate your transparency," she said. "I'll make sure my review accounts for the updated protocols." He left apparently satisfied or performing satisfaction, which she noted were not the same thing. 40 minutes later, Sergeant Okafor appeared in her doorway with an expression that was more controlled than usual, which meant something had disrupted his composure and he was managing it. "Ma'am," he said, "there's a visitor at the main gate asking for you. She's not on the appointment schedule. She says you'll know the context." "Name?" "Vasquez, ma'am. Colonel Pilar Vasquez." The room stayed very still for 1 full second. "Bring her in," Maya said. "My office." Vasquez was 53 and moved with the specific physical economy of someone who had spent significant time in field environments before transitioning to the investigative side of the house. She was sharp-faced and dark-eyed, and she sat down without being asked, which Maya approved of, and she put a tablet on the desk face down rather than leading with it, which Maya also approved of. "How long have you been investigating Red Valley?" Maya asked. 7 months, Vasquez said. "Since about 3 weeks after the Dre incident." "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. I initiated it. The division has standing audit authority, and I used it." A pause. "I've been trying to identify who at Red Valley connected to the network above this installation, and I've spent 7 months hitting a wall at Breck because Breck is careful and because the people above him are more careful still." "Harlan Steck," Maya said. Vasquez's expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but the recalibration of someone who has been operating on partial information and has just been handed a piece that changes the picture. "Where did you get that name?" 11-year-old classified briefing document, the procurement review that closed without findings. I connected it to a training fatality from the same period. "The Morrow fatality," Vasquez said. "Fort Dellen, 3 years before the review. We found the same connection. That gave us the historical pattern, but pattern isn't prosecution. What I've been missing is the current transactional link, something that shows active direction from above Breck, not just a circumstantial overlap with historical events." "The credential code," Maya said. 9 days ago. That was you accessing the range modification addendum. I've had access to the planning files for 6 weeks. I've been reviewing them in intervals to avoid triggering a flag on the access monitoring system." She looked at Maya steadily. "I didn't know you'd find the code. I didn't know you'd be looking at the access logs. I didn't know those were your footprints until this morning. They looked at each other for a moment. Two people who had been running parallel approaches toward the same wall and had just turned a corner to find each other. The modification addendum with the single signature, Maya said. That's the physical evidence of what was done to Dre's position, but it doesn't prove direction from above Breck on its own. No, Vasquez agreed. What proves direction from above is the selection manipulation data. I've spent 7 months building a comparative analysis of Red Valley referral recommendations against actual operator performance metrics. The divergence is systematic. Over 4 years, the program has under-referred consistently exceptional operators and over-referred consistently mediocre ones, in patterns that correlate with contract award cycles in STEC's division. Maya absorbed that. The operators who got referred upward. A significant percentage went into specialty programs that carry equipment procurement dependencies. Training contracts, gear selection, evaluation software licensing, all flowing through STEC's division or organizations he has direct influence over. Vasquez's voice was flat and matter-of-fact. The voice of someone who has been carrying something ugly for a long time and has learned to carry it without letting the weight show in the telling. Breck controls the referrals. STEC controls what happens to the operators once they're in the programs above. The whole structure was designed to convert selection outcomes into procurement influence. And Dre was too good to manipulate, Maya said. Dre's scores were outside the normal manipulation envelope. You can adjust by a few percentage points and have it read as natural variation. His margins were too large. The only options were to fail him outright, which would have generated questions given his profile, or to remove him from the pipeline before he made it to the formal selection stage. The room was very quiet. "What do you need from me?" Maya asked. "The access log you pulled this morning, the external credential entry. I need that in a formal evidentiary format, pulled under your program director authority, because my access to the planning files has been through an audit pathway that the division's legal office is currently debating the scope of." A pause. "In plain terms, my access may be challengeable. Yours isn't. You need me to formally request everything you've already found. I need you to formally establish the evidentiary chain through a channel that can't be argued away in a hearing." Vasquez met her eyes. "And I need you to do it before Breck understands what you've found, because when he understands, the window closes. He will move the remaining documentation, and he will contact whoever above him needs to know. And at that point, this becomes a suppression operation rather than an investigation." "How long do I have?" "I don't know. If someone in his office noticed the planning file access and reported it up, the clock started yesterday evening. If not, you have until whenever his morning briefings reach that item." Vasquez paused. "My read is you have hours, not days." Maya thought about the door handle moving the night before, the footsteps retreating down the corridor. "My read is less than that," she said. She picked up her desk phone, the internal landline, the only channel she currently half-trusted, and called Rourke in the operations training branch. "Sergeant Rourke, I need to formalize a records request under Program Director Evidentiary Authority. Full documentation package for the last 18 months of field exercise planning files, access logs, and modification addenda. I need it submitted to the base legal office in the next 40 minutes as a formal preservation request." A pause. "Ma'am, a preservation request triggers an automatic notification to the Commandant's office." "I know. And to the Deputy Commandant." "I know that too." Another pause, shorter this time. "I'll have the request ready for your signature in 20 minutes. Maya set the phone down and looked at Vasquez. The notification to Breck triggers when the preservation request goes in. After that, whatever he does is on record as a response to a formal legal process. "Which makes his response evidence," Vasquez said. "Yes. That's a fast play." "You said hours." Maya stood. "Let's use them." The 20 minutes it took Rourke to prepare the request were the most tactically loaded 20 minutes Maya had spent in years. Not because of action, but because of the specific tension of waiting in a position where the first person to move would determine the terrain for everything that followed. She signed the request in Rourke's office at 10:23. Rourke submitted it at 10:24. The notification to the Commandant's office and the Deputy Commandant went out automatically at 10:24 and 18 seconds. At 10:41, Pruitt appeared in the corridor outside her office. He didn't knock. He stood in the open doorway, and she was behind her desk with Vasquez in the chair beside it, and he looked at Vasquez for a long moment before he looked at Maya. "Commander Breck would like to meet with you," he said. "Now." "I'm in a meeting," Maya said. "He said it's urgent." "I heard you." She looked at him with the same measured attention she'd given him in the staff meeting, the expression that gave nothing and took everything. "Tell him I'll be available at 1300. Pruitt's jaw moved. He looked at Vasquez again, longer this time, reading her uniform, her rank, the divisional identifier on her shoulder. Something shifted in his face, a small, specific change in the quality of his composure, the kind of shift that happens when a person recalculates their exposure and finds the number larger than they'd estimated. He left without saying anything further. "He'll report back immediately," Vasquez said. "Yes." "Breck will escalate within 10 minutes. "I know." Maya looked at her notebook, at the credential code and the name beneath it. "When he escalates, the escalation goes to Steck's network." "Which is what we need," Vasquez said. "The escalation is the contact evidence. The moment Breck reaches out to Steck or anyone in his orbit in response to a formal preservation request, that communication is potentially interceptable," Maya said, "if someone is monitoring Steck's communications." Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "Are they?" "I don't know, but the person who sent me here might know." She paused. "And if his chain of communication above him is compromised, there's another way to get that monitoring in place." She picked up her notebook and wrote a number from memory, the number from the card she'd burned. She slid the notebook across the desk toward Vasquez. "That's a direct channel, 2 stars. He needs to know about the escalation event the moment it happens, through a route that doesn't go through his standard chain." Vasquez looked at the number. "You trust him?" "Enough. More than the alternatives." Vasquez took out her own phone and photographed the number. "I'll route it through my division's secure communications, which is outside his chain entirely." She paused. "If this works, if the escalation produces the contact evidence and Whitmore can get monitoring authorized in time, we're looking at a formal arrest recommendation within 72 hours. And if it doesn't work?" Vasquez looked at her evenly. "Then Breck has a window to move the remaining documentation, Steck has a window to distance himself from Red Valley, and we start over with less than we have now." Maya thought about Marcus Dre's photograph on a tablet screen, the career over before it was supposed to begin, the exercise range in the flat desert light, the positions marked in the planning document at their original distances, the modification addendum with its single signature and its blank line where an authorization should have been. "It's going to work," she said. Not because she was certain, because the alternative was a thing she wasn't willing to carry. At 10:57, her desk phone rang. She let it ring 3 times before she picked up. "Director Voss." Breck's voice was very controlled. "I've been informed that a preservation request was submitted this morning under your authority." "That's correct." "I'd like to discuss the scope of that request before we involve the legal office any further." A pause. "Some of what you're requesting contains sensitive operational materials that require appropriate handling protocols." "The legal office handles sensitive materials regularly," she said. "The preservation request ensures they're handled correctly." A longer pause this time. "Maya." The shift to her first name was deliberate, an attempt to change the register of the conversation, to make it smaller and more personal, and therefore more manageable. "I want to make sure we're working toward the same goals here. Red Valley's program has a strong record. The people here are professionals. Whatever questions you have about the Dre incident, I can address them directly without involving outside agencies." "I appreciate that," she said. "The legal office will coordinate the formal process. I'll see you at 1300. She hung up. Vasquez was already on her phone, voice low, speaking to someone on the other end in the abbreviated, reference-coded language of someone reporting to an active monitoring operation. Maya sat at her desk and looked at the dry erase board. Timeline. Equipment. Access. She had all 3. At 11:19, Vasquez looked up from her phone. Her expression had the particular quality of someone who has received the information they were waiting for and is deciding how to carry it. "Whitmore's channel received the message," she said. "He's initiating a monitoring authorization through the Inspector General's office, which runs outside his standard chain. He says 72 hours. A pause. "He also says something else. Tell me." He says Steck isn't acting alone above Breck. There's a second name. Vasquez looked at her steadily. The second name is someone inside Whitmore's own chain, someone who knew about this investigation from the beginning. The room went very still. Whitmore wants to know if you're willing to stay in position for the 72 hours, because if you pull out now, the network goes dark and we lose the monitoring window. Vasquez paused. If you stay, you're inside a facility where the people running the cover-up now know you're actively building a case against them, and the person who originally briefed them about your investigation is still in a position to direct their response. Maya looked at the notebook on her desk, at the credential code and the two names beneath it, and now the implication of a third. 72 hours inside Red Valley, with Breck escalating and Pruitt watching her corridor, and an unknown figure inside Whitmore's chain who had been feeding information about her since before she arrived. She thought about Okafor's face when he described flagging the range configuration to Pruitt, the specific discomfort of someone who had done the right thing and watched it be ignored. She thought about Rourke saying Sergeant Dre did good work here in a voice that was professional and careful and could not quite conceal that it was also something more than that. She thought about 4 junior operators at Black Ridge and the specific release in Stellard's shoulders when she'd been told plainly that she was exceptional. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." And then her office door opened. Not Pruitt this time, not Okafor. The man who walked through her door was in civilian clothes, and she knew his face immediately from the operational briefings she had reviewed during the years when she was still the kind of person who got sent into situations that produced classified records. And the reason her hands went absolutely still and her breathing went completely even was not because she was afraid, though she should have been, but because the face that walked into her office was the face of the second name she had not yet been given, the name inside Whitmore's chain, and he was looking at her with the precise, assessing expression of a man who has arrived ahead of a problem he was sent to contain. "Sergeant Voss," he said pleasantly, "we need to talk about what you think you've found." His name was Deputy Director Conrad Fells, and he had the particular ease of a man who had never once walked into a room where he wasn't the most dangerous person present. Until now. He was 60, lean in the way of someone who maintained physical discipline as a control practice rather than a health one, with silver-gray hair and the kind of face that photographed well in official portraits and revealed nothing in person. He carried no visible credentials, no briefcase, nothing that would mark him to a casual observer as anything other than a senior civilian who had arrived for a scheduled meeting. The civilian clothes were deliberate. They created ambiguity, kept the encounter off the formal record, gave him the option of framing this conversation afterward as informal, preliminary, a collegial check-in between professionals rather than an intervention. Maya recognized all of that immediately. She recognized him from the operational briefings the way you recognize a landmark. Not intimately, but with enough specificity to place him accurately in the landscape. Conrad Fells had been attached to the Defense Training Oversight Division in a senior capacity for 9 years. He was the signature on the closing memo of the 11-year-old procurement review. He was the figure whose name appeared in the historical pattern Vasquez had been building toward for 7 months without being able to reach. He was, in the precise sense of the word, the architecture. Vasquez had gone very still in the chair beside the desk, still in the way of someone who is recalibrating and doing it fast, the controlled adjustment of a person who has just had a significant variable enter the equation and is working out what it changes. Maya gestured toward the empty chair on the other side of the desk. "Sit down." He sat, which told her he'd decided on the conversational approach rather than the authority approach, at least to start. He looked at Vasquez once, a brief, assessing look that landed and moved on, and then he focused on Maya with the steady, pleasant attention of a man who was very good at this. "The preservation request is going to create a significant amount of administrative difficulty," he said, "for this installation, for the people here, and for some processes that have been operating under appropriate oversight for years." "Appropriate oversight," Maya said. "The Training Oversight Division has audit authority over Red Valley's program. Any evidentiary process runs through that authority, not around it." "Colonel Vasquez's audit authority," Maya said, "which is current and active. Your authority in this room right now is what exactly?" A small pause. "I'm here in an advisory capacity." "Advising whom?" The pleasantness in his face didn't change, but something behind it thinned. Director Voss, you've been in this role for less than 48 hours. What you found in that time is genuinely impressive, but what you think you found and what you've actually found are different things, and the differences matter enormously for how this proceeds. Walk me through the differences, Maya said. He leaned forward slightly. The modification addendum has a single signature because the authorization was verbal, communicated through established channels, and documented in a supplementary record that isn't part of the planning file system. The selection divergence data that I assume you've been given, a glance at Vasquez, who said nothing, is a statistical artifact of a cohort composition change that happened over the same period. The credential access you found in the log was a routine audit pull, documented in the division's internal records. He paused. Every piece of this has an explanation. The explanations are in the correct files. You've been building a case on incomplete documentation. He said it with the calm authority of someone who has delivered this speech before and watched it work. Maya looked at him for a moment. The supplementary record that authorized the modification addendum verbally, she said. Where is it? The division's records. Can I see it? Through the formal audit request process, yes. Which runs through your office. Through the division? Yes. She nodded slowly. The Morrow fatality at Fort Dellen, she said. 14 years ago. Equipment failure, individual error. Same language as the Dre report. His expression didn't change, but the quality of the stillness behind it changed. A degree of attention that hadn't been there before, a recalibration of his assessment of what she actually knew. That's a closed case, he said. I know, you closed it. A beat of silence that was different from the previous ones. Fells looked at her with something new in his face. Not quite the pleasant advisory demeanor, not yet the openly adversarial posture, but the specific expression of a man who has arrived to contain a problem and has just understood the problem is larger than his briefing suggested. Sergeant Voss, he said, and the shift back to her rank was its own tell, the conversational register resetting to formal, the advisory frame being quietly replaced with something more structural. I want to be clear about what happens if this process goes forward on the track you're currently on. The preservation request implicates a significant number of people and programs. The secondary effects of a formal investigation at this level extend well beyond Red Valley and well beyond the people you're looking at here. People who have nothing to do with any of this get caught in it. Like Marcus Dre, she said. The room went quiet. Marcus Dre, Fells said carefully, was involved in an accident. Marcus Dre was moved 80 meters closer to an impact zone by a modification addendum that bears one signature and no authorization, as part of a systematic effort to remove him from the selection pipeline, because he was too good to manipulate through the normal channel. She held his gaze without effort, without performance, with the specific quality of stillness that she'd spent 15 years developing on firing lines and in rooms like this one. He's 26 years old and he's relearning how to walk. I'm not interested in the secondary effects on the programs. Fells looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, You need to think carefully about what you're starting. I've been thinking about it since I got here. She picked up her desk phone. I'm going to make a call now. You're welcome to stay. She called Rourke first, not Whitmore, not Vasquez's division, not any channel Fells would have anticipated. She called Rourke and said 4 words. Has anything been moved? Rourke said, Not yet. I've been watching. Keep watching. She hung up and looked at Fells. The reason I'm telling you this in front of you, she said, is that I want you to understand that I know what the next move in your playbook looks like. You came here to assess what I have and whether it can be contained. The answer to both questions is going to be the same, more than you expected, and no. Fells stood. His pleasantness was entirely gone now, replaced with the clean, careful authority of a man resetting to his actual operating register. This is going to be messy, he said, for everyone involved. Mess is fine, she said. Mess means it happened. He left. Vasquez let out a breath that she'd been managing for the last 8 minutes. He's going to make calls the moment he clears the building. Yes. And those calls will be monitored. Maya was already moving, reaching for her notebook, running through the sequence of what needed to happen in the next window before Fells could direct a response from outside the base. How long to get Whitmore's IG authorization active? It was filed 40 minutes ago. Authorization at that level is a 4 to 6 hour process minimum. We don't have 4 hours. Vasquez was already on her phone. I know someone who can expedite the filing. It won't accelerate the authorization, but it gets the monitoring package in place provisionally, which means whatever Fells says in the next 2 hours is captured, even if the formal authorization comes later. She paused. It's a procedural gray area. Use it. Maya picked up her desk phone again and called a number she'd memorized from the Inter-Installation Training Network directory the previous evening, a specific number for the base inspector general's office, which operated independently of both the commandant and the deputy commandant's chains. The IG officer was a major named Theus, who had the cautious, precise manner of someone who understood exactly what the independence of their office meant and took it seriously. Major Theus, this is Program Director Voss. I have documentation related to a formal safety incident that I believe requires preservation under evidentiary protocols. I'd like to walk it over to your office in the next 30 minutes. A pause. Director Voss, has this documentation been through the commandant's chain? No, I'm bringing it directly to your office because the documentation involves the deputy commandant's office, and the IG's independence is the appropriate pathway. A longer pause. I'll be here. She gathered the printed access logs, her notebook with the credential code and the names, and the planning file documents she'd been working from. She looked at Vasquez. Can you stay in this office until I get back? I'm not going anywhere, Vasquez said. Maya walked to the IG's office at the same pace she always walked. Purposeful, unhurried, the pace of someone who has somewhere to be and is getting there without announcing it. The compound was moving through its morning rhythms, personnel crossing the parade ground, vehicles on the access road, the normal ambient activity of a functioning military installation. She passed Pruitt on the path between the administration building and the equipment bay. He saw her, and his pace slowed, and she looked at him with the same steady expression she'd given him in every interaction and kept walking. She spent 45 minutes in Thies' office, walking through the documentation methodically, not narratively, not dramatically, just the sequence of evidence and what it indicated. Thies asked precise, careful questions and made notes in a small binder with the kind of thoroughness that meant he was building his own record of this conversation as a separate evidentiary layer. When she left, she had a formal IG intake receipt with a case number. The case number meant the documentation was now in an independent custodial chain that neither Breck nor Fells could access or influence without creating an additional record of the attempt. At 12:47, 13 minutes before the 1300 meeting with Breck, her desk phone rang. It was Whitmore. He didn't sound like he had in the folding chair office at Black Ridge. He sounded like a man who had been running hard behind a situation and had just caught up with it. Fells contacted Steck 11 minutes ago from a vehicle on the road outside Red Valley, he said. The provisional monitoring captured it. Fells told Steck that the documentation chain was compromised, and they needed to initiate the contingency protocol they'd established for this scenario. Which means they had a contingency. Which means they anticipated this investigation getting this far at some point, and they prepared for it. The contingency involves a records transfer authorization that Steck can execute from his end, which would move the documentation out of the federal records system into a private contractor archive that falls outside normal audit authority. A pause. He hasn't executed it yet, but if he does, it happens fast. What stops him? We need a federal preservation order that covers the contractor archive specifically. That requires a judge. Another pause. I have a contact in the federal district court who can expedite emergency preservation filings. But I need you to formally request it through the IG case number, because the IG case is the evidentiary foundation. I have the IG case number. Give it to me. She read it from the receipt. Stay in position, he said. This is going to move fast in the next few hours. Don't go to that 1300 meeting with Breck. Why? Because Fells called Breck after he called Steck. We don't have the content of that call yet, but the timing suggests Breck was being given instructions, not being briefed. I don't want you in a room with him until we know what he was told to do. She was quiet for a moment. Whitmore, the second name in your chain, the person who briefed Fells about my appointment before I arrived. A long pause. Long enough that she registered the shape of his discomfort through the phone line. I know who it was, he said. So do I, she said. Or I can work it out from what I have. I'm less interested in who it was than in whether you've secured that channel. Another pause. It's been secured. Then I'll stay in position. She called Breck's office at 12:58 and told his aide she needed to postpone the 1300 meeting to tomorrow morning. The aide said she'd pass the message. Maya said thank you and hung up. And then she went and stood at her office window and looked at the parade ground where the stray field cap had been yesterday, which was now gone. And she breathed the specific quality of air that comes into a room when a situation is past the point of no return and there is nothing to do but be present for what it becomes. The 72 hours that followed were not dramatic in the visual sense of dramatic. They were the specific, grinding, document-heavy labor of a formal federal investigation, landing on an institution that was simultaneously trying to cooperate, contain, and in several cases flee. Steck executed the contingency protocol at 18:04 on the first evening. The records transferred to the contractor archive, 6 minutes before the federal preservation order arrived through the district court. The 6-minute window meant a portion of the documentation moved before it was legally frozen. The portion that moved was reconstructible from the IG case materials and the copies Vasquez had been building for 7 months. But it was a close thing, and the closeness of it was something Maya noted and filed without letting it produce the feeling it was trying to produce, which was relief. She didn't let herself feel relief yet. Breck was formally placed on administrative leave at 09:30 on the second morning, delivered by a notice from the commandant's office. Ives, who had been briefed by the IG, and who moved with the controlled urgency of an officer who understood that his installation was either going to be the place where something was fixed or the place where something was buried, and had made a clear decision about which of those his record would reflect. The notice was delivered while the morning staff meeting was assembled, which meant every member of the Red Valley program staff was present when Breck's aide walked in and handed him the envelope. The room's reaction was not surprise exactly. It was the specific quality of a collective exhale. The sound a group of people makes when a thing they have known for a long time to be wrong has finally been named as wrong in a way that cannot be unnamed. Pruitt was escorted from the facility at 11:45 of the same morning by 2 IG investigators, whose jurisdiction derived from the federal preservation order, and who were not Red Valley personnel, and therefore not subject to any instruction Breck or Fells could have given them. He left without saying anything to anyone in the corridor, which was its own form of testimony. The silence of a man who has run out of the construction that talking provided. Fells was placed on administrative suspension from the Defense Training Oversight Division at 1600 on the second day, pending a formal investigation by an interagency oversight body that Vasquez had spent 7 months positioning herself to trigger and had triggered the moment the federal preservation order created a formal evidentiary foundation. The suspension was not an arrest. It was not a conviction. It was the first visible crack in the architecture, and cracks propagate. Steck's situation was more complex because Steck's insulation was more deliberate. The 6-minute window before the preservation order had moved some documentation. His legal representation arrived within hours of the suspension news and was well prepared, which meant he had anticipated this possibility and had prepared for it, which was its own kind of evidence about what he knew. The investigation into his role would take longer and produce results more slowly. But it would produce them. Vasquez had built too much of the foundation for it not to. The second name in Whitmore's chain, the person who had briefed Fells about Maya's appointment, turned out to be a brigadier general named Osso, who had been in Whitmore's administrative chain for 3 years and had managed his access to the oversight situation with enough care that Whitmore himself had not identified the channel until the monitoring captured a specific communication pattern. Osso's suspension followed Fells's by 18 hours. It was quieter, more internal, the kind of accountability that happens in rooms without audiences. Maya never met him and never needed to. On the third day, she drove to Carver Medical Facility. It was a 2-hour drive across the high desert and then into the suburbs of a mid-sized city, and she drove it alone with the windows cracked, the dry air, and the smell of juniper moving through the car, thinking about very little in the focused, empty way that long drives sometimes allowed. The mountains had receded behind her by the time she reached the facility, and the landscape had changed from dramatic to ordinary. The particular ordinarianism of a city that was just a city, doing the quiet daily business of being inhabited. Marcus Dre was in a rehabilitation unit on the 4th floor. She had called ahead, spoken to his case manager, identified herself. The case manager had said he was having a good week, which told her something about what the bad weeks looked like. He was sitting in a wheelchair by the window when she came in, which she hadn't expected. He had a book face down on his lap and the slightly unfocused expression of someone who has been staring at a middle distance rather than reading. He was 26, and the photograph had been accurate. Lean, dark-haired, the careful, composed quality of a person who managed their external presentation deliberately. But the photograph had not captured the particular quality of contained anger that she saw in his face when he looked up at her. The anger of someone who has been sitting with injustice long enough that it has restructured itself into something quieter and harder. "Director Voss," he said. "Call me Maya." She pulled a chair over and sat down, which changed the conversation from formal to actual. "How's the PT going?" "Slow." A pause. "They tell me I'll walk without assistance by the end of the year. Probably. Probably is better than the alternative, probably." He looked at her for a moment. "They told me about the preservation order, and Breck." He paused again. "And the rest of it." "You'll be contacted formally. The investigation timeline is... It'll take time. I want you to know that the documentation is solid. What happened to you is documented now in a way that can't be walked back." "Will it change anything?" The question was direct and undecorated. The question of someone who had been given careful non-answers for a long time and had run out of patience for them. "For you, specifically, your record will be formally corrected. The complaint you filed will be reinstated in the administrative record and appended with the investigation findings. The injury will be reclassified from individual error to institutional negligence. Your evaluation scores from the Red Valley cohort will be restored to their pre-manipulation record, which means your selection profile is intact." She looked at him steadily. "Whether you can pursue selection, that's a medical question that I'm not in a position to answer, but your record won't be the thing that stops you." He was quiet for a long time. "I filed that complaint because I thought the process worked," he said. "I thought there was a channel, and the channel meant something." "The channel was compromised. That's not the same as the channel being wrong." "It feels the same from here." "I know," she said. "It should feel the same from there. What happened to you was a failure of every system that was supposed to protect you, and you're entitled to be angry about that without someone telling you it was an anomaly, and the system is actually fine." She paused. "The system is not fine. It's a system run by people, and some of the people were corrupt, and they used the system structure to protect the corruption. That's real, and it happened, and no formal record correction makes it unfelt." He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a version of that sentence for a long time. "But," she said, "the people who built the structure around it are being held to account. Not perfectly. Not as fast as it should happen. Not without the kind of institutional friction that makes you want to throw things." She met his eyes. "But it's happening. And part of why it's happening is because you filed that complaint. The complaint was the thread. Without it, there was nothing to pull." "I didn't feel like I was pulling anything," he said quietly. "I felt like I was shouting into a room with no one in it." "You were. And then someone else came into the room." He looked out the window at the ordinary mid-city view, a parking structure, some trees, a stretch of sky that was the flat pale blue of late afternoon. His hands on the book in his lap were still. "What happens to Red Valley?" he asked. "It keeps running," she said. "That's the answer that's hardest to hear, I think, but it's the honest one. The program continues under new oversight. Breck's staff is being reviewed individually. The selection pipeline is being audited by Vasquez's team. Some people who belong there stay, some who don't leave." She paused. "And it gets a program director who's going to look at every evaluation, every position assignment, every modification addendum, and ask the question that should have been asked the first time." He looked back at her. "You're staying." "I'm staying." Something in his face shifted. Not resolution, not comfort, something less complete than those words implied. The shift of a person who has been carrying a weight and has been told that some portion of it is being redistributed, not removed, and is working out how to carry what's left. "Okay," he said. She stayed another 40 minutes. They talked about the rehabilitation timeline, about what he'd been reading, about nothing particularly consequential. When she left, she shook his hand, which felt like the right register. Not the empty warmth of someone performing care, but the specific acknowledgement of two people who had been involved in the same thing from different angles and had met at the end of it. In the elevator going down, She let herself feel the things she'd been managing since she'd walked into her Red Valley office 5 days ago and found a dry erase board and a window overlooking a parade ground. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something more complicated and less clean than satisfaction. The feeling of a thing that needed doing having been done, mixed with the full understanding of what it had cost the people it should have protected before it got done, and the knowledge that those two things would always be in tension with each other, and that the tension was not something to resolve but something to carry correctly. 3 weeks later, Ethan Cole showed up at Red Valley. Not officially. He wasn't assigned there, wasn't on any paperwork. He appeared at the front gate on a Tuesday afternoon and gave Maya's name to the guard, who called her, and she told the guard to let him through. He found her on Range Complex B, running a wind assessment exercise with 6 members of the new cohort. She saw him arrive at the observation line and kept going. Finished the exercise, walked the cohort through the assessment debrief, dismissed them for the day. Then she walked over to where he was standing with his hands in the pockets of a civilian jacket and the specific expression of someone who has driven a significant distance to have a conversation and is figuring out how to start it. Vasquez briefed my unit, he said, about what happened here. All right? I wanted to come in person. He paused. I know that's not a particularly tactical reason. It doesn't have to be tactical. He looked at the range, the flags, the distance markers, the terrain that was different from Black Ridge but had the same quality of openness. Are you okay? Nobody had asked her that, in those specific words, in the 3 weeks since the preservation request and the administrative leaves and the drive to Carver Medical. Not Whitmore, who had called twice with updates and gratitude, and the specific warmth of a man who understands he owes someone more than he can easily articulate. Not Vasquez, who had a case to build and was building it. Not Okafor, who had stopped in her doorway twice to give her updates, and both times looked like he had something else to say, and both times decided not to. She looked at Cole for a moment. This person who had handed her a rifle on a bench at Black Ridge because he had recognized something and acted on it without needing to explain himself first. Not entirely, she said, but more than I was. He nodded. That was enough. They stood at the observation line while the late afternoon light went orange and long across the range, and she told him some of what had happened. Not the whole sequence, not the evidentiary architecture, just the shape of it, the feel of the days as they'd moved. He listened the way he'd listened at Black Ridge, without filling the silences, without performing attentiveness, just actually there. Dre, she said, I went to see him. How is he? Angry, working. She paused. He'll be all right. Not in the way he was supposed to be all right. Different. Different isn't always less. No, she agreed. It isn't. The cohort had cleared the range and the compound was settling into its late afternoon rhythm, the specific quiet of a military installation between the day's last formal activity and the evening. She looked at the range flags, which were moving in a pattern she recognized from 3 weeks of morning assessments, a particular wind behavior specific to this terrain at this time of day. There are 4 shooters in the current cohort, she said, who need what Nwosu and Stellard and the others needed at Black Ridge. They don't know they need it yet. They'll figure it out. They'll figure it out faster if someone tells them plainly what they're already doing right. She looked at him. That's the thing nobody does. They spend so much time correcting the wrong that they forget to confirm the right, and people don't know where to stand when nobody's told them their footing is solid. He was quiet for a moment. Is that what you needed when you were coming up? She thought about it honestly. I needed people to stop deciding what I was before I'd shown them. That was most of it. She paused. The rest of it I figured out by being in rooms where I wasn't supposed to be good at things, and being good at them anyway. Until someone handed you a better rifle. Until someone handed me a better rifle, she agreed, and then I used it. The light was going fully orange now, the desert going the kind of amber that made distances look different than they were, compressed or extended depending on the angle. It was the kind of light that made people in photographs look more significant than they felt in the moment. But she wasn't in a photograph. She was standing on a firing range in the high desert with a person who had recognized something in her before he'd had any reason to, and the work she'd come here to do had been done, at least the first version of it, and there was a morning cohort session at 0630 and 4 shooters who didn't yet know their footing was solid. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The formal findings from the combined investigation were released internally 6 weeks later and publicly summarized in a Department of Defense review update 2 months after that. Harlan Steck was removed from his position and faced formal procurement fraud charges with a recommended referral to federal prosecution. Conrad Fels's suspension was converted to termination following a finding of administrative misconduct and obstruction of an IG investigation. Brigadier General also accepted a forced early retirement under a finding of dereliction of duty. Vance Pruitt was discharged and faced a separate criminal referral related to the modification addendum and its connection to Dre's injury. Commander Breck was censured, reduced in rank, and removed from any training command position permanently. He did not go to prison. That was the thing that sat least well, and Maya didn't pretend otherwise when Okafor asked her about it one morning in the corridor. "Institutional accountability has limits," she said. "That's not an excuse. It's just a fact that you have to decide what to do with." "What do you do with it?" he asked. "I run a better program," she said. "So the next person who's supposed to be protected actually is." Marcus Dre's formal record correction was processed and finalized. His evaluation scores were restored. The complaint he had filed was reinstated, appended with a full finding, and entered into the permanent Red Valley administrative record with a citation noting that the complaint had been the initiating thread of a federal investigation. He was offered a formal apology from the Commandant's office, which he accepted. I was also offered a special advisory consultation role in the IG's ongoing review of selection pipeline integrity across all training installations, which he accepted after thinking about it for 4 days. He still walked with a cane. He would probably always walk with a cane. That was the part that didn't get corrected by any formal process, and Maya knew it, and she held that knowledge without softening it. Derek Halston sent her a message 3 months after Black Ridge. It was short and unpolished and clearly not revised, which she appreciated. He said he'd been thinking about the day since it happened and had been going back through his career looking for other moments where he'd made the same error in a lower stakes context. He said there were several. He asked if she'd be willing to talk at some point about what she'd said to the junior shooters at Black Ridge, because he was now supervising a team of junior operators, and he was trying to do it better than he'd been doing it. She wrote back the same day. She told him yes. She told him the most important thing was to lead with what people were doing right before you addressed what they were doing wrong. Not because the wrong things didn't matter, but because people can only build on a foundation of knowing where they're solid. She told him to ask questions before he assessed. She told him to remember that the version of someone he saw in the first week was not the full version, and that assumptions made early calcified in ways that were hard to break, and that following your assumptions was easier than following your attention, but paid out much worse. She thought about writing more, but stopped at that. He didn't need a curriculum. He needed to go back to his team and practice the things she'd described, badly at first, and then better, and make his own version of it that was specific to him and his context and the people he was responsible for. That was how it worked. Not instructions handed down, but practices built up, imperfectly, repeatedly, with more failures than successes at the start. She had been doing it for 15 years and she was still building it. The morning she ran the first formal evaluation of the new Red Valley cohort, she arrived at Range Complex B at 0545, 45 minutes before the first shooter was due. She walked the range in the early light, checked the flags, noted the wind pattern, looked at the distance markers and the terrain she had been learning for weeks, and was still learning. She stood at the 800-meter position and looked downrange at a target that was a small dark shape in the low light. She thought about a firing line in the Caraway Mountains and laughter that had started before she raised the rifle. She thought about a bench outside an equipment bay and a man setting a rifle down beside her and saying, "Use this," in a voice that was not offering charity but recognizing quality. She thought about Dre by his window with a book face down on his lap, and Nwosu reassembling her rifle with a different quality of intention, and Okafor standing in a corridor working out which authority represented the greater consequence and choosing correctly. She thought about the long argument of her career, the rooms she'd been in where she wasn't supposed to be good at things, the assessments made before she'd spoken, the equipment dismissed before it was fired, the woman behind the rifle who nobody had thought to ask about before they'd decided what she was. The light was coming up now, the desert going from gray to amber to the clear flat gold of a high desert morning, and somewhere on the access road she could hear the first vehicle arriving, the first members of the cohort coming out, to a range where the evaluation criteria were going to be different from what they'd been under the previous director. Not easier, not softer, but honest, based on what was actually there rather than what the evaluator expected to find. That was the job. Not to be the most impressive person in the room, not to prove a point to the people who'd missed it the first time. Not even to be right, though she intended to be right as often as she could manage. Just to see clearly. To look at what was in front of her without the distorting weight of expectation, her own or anyone else's, and to act on what she actually saw. The first vehicle pulled up. Doors opened. Voices. Maya Voss turned away from the 800-meter target, picked up her assessment board, and walked out to meet her cohort in the gold morning light of a day that was going to be exactly as hard as it needed to be. The world does not give you credit for what you carry quietly. It notices the shot, not the years of preparation that made the shot possible. It remembers the moment, not the discipline that produced the moment. And so the person who has been building in silence, who has been carrying the weight of competence in rooms that refuse to acknowledge it, who has learned to be still and patient and accurate when everything around her was noise. That person has to make peace with the fact that most of what she is will never be seen by the people who benefit from it most. But some of it will be seen. By the 4 junior operators who needed to be told their footing was solid. By the young soldier who needed to hear that her trigger discipline was exceptional before she could believe it herself. By a 26-year-old man sitting by a hospital window with a cane beside his chair who needed to know that the complaint he'd filed into a room that felt empty had actually been heard. That was what it was for, not the record, not the recognition, not the composite score at the top of a board in a facility that hadn't expected her name to be there. The work. The actual, daily, unglamorous, load-bearing work of being the person in the room who sees clearly and acts accordingly and stays when staying is the harder choice, because someone has to be that person, and the world is better when it is. Maya had known that for a long time. Now she had a range, a cohort, and a morning. It was enough to start.